one of the Cooper drivers was quite a well-known driver, subsequently one of the few drivers to posthumously win the World Championship, a driver called Jochen Rindt. And he moved teams, just as sporting superstars move from one team to another, from Cooper's to Brabham's, my old tea-making stomping ground. And he approached me and said, you know, would I go with him? The World Championship was very seasonal at that time, and most of the Grand Prix teams supplemented their income by manufacturing cars for the lower categories of racing. And getting out of that manufacturing for other people's part of the company into Formula One was extremely difficult. So knowing that this was the same sort of work practice at Brabham, and that effectively most of the Grand Prix mechanics had to go back into the production, I actually stipulated that if I went to Brabham's, it was on the basis that I wouldn't go into the production facilities. I would be solely, exclusively focused on Formula One. And to actually give me something to do, they put me onto the R&D program and the car development. And I formed a very close relationship then with the part owner and principal driver, which was Jack Brabham. And by the time we got to the beginning of the season, he had persuaded me to work on his car as opposed to Rindt's car, which somehow they smoothed over with Rindt. But that started a long relationship where ultimately I emerged into a sort of more of a team manager. Whilst there are comparable titles in motor racing now, the actual function of the job was completely different. The chief mechanic effectively was responsible for virtually everything other than the money and handling the drivers. So a team manager would sort of turn up 5 minutes before practice and leave half an hour after practice. Probably not quite accurate, but basically it was a come and go, and the chief mechanic was really responsible for everything. Save the money and save the drivers. So towards the end of the season, Brabham had decided to retire. And I didn't really want to work for any other driver, and I had a sense of who was actually going to join the team and drive for the team. And then something relatively fortuitous occurred. Brabham was very keen to go back to England immediately after the race, and said, well, you know, I'm going to go straight after the race. I want you to go to the race official's office the next day, pick up the cheque, go to the bank, cash the cheque, take the money to Mexico City, and deposit it in the safe, and basically I'll see you XYZ days in Mexico City. One of the few perks of that particular era was that the American Grand Prix was followed by the Mexican Grand Prix, and the cars were not flown from Watkins Glen to Mexico City. They were driven, i.e. put onto trailers and driven, which took some time. So the moment that the cars had left, everybody jumped on the plane to Mexico City and then bought a short ticket to Acapulco. So Acapulco was just mind-blowing in those early days. It was sort of a supercharged version of Rio. It was full of fun, full of risque entertainment. It was just amazing. And so I'd performed all my duties and deposited the briefcase in the safe in Mexico City, and off I went to Acapulco. And I was lying by the swimming pool, musing over what am I going to do, etc., etc. So I thought, I've run the team. The drivers came and went. I collected the money. Why don't I do my own team? Because if you have a good team, the drivers want to drive for you. Well, how naive was that? A little thing of capital didn't exist, and so with not so many savings and with a lot of help from other people, I started my own team in one of the lower categories. Completely unheard of. This became the norm. In a few years after, most small teams were started by young mechanics or engineers that had seen what I could do and how I had basically made what appeared to be impossible possible. I was in my 20s, mid-20s. And the driver for the following season, following Brabham's retirement, was Graham Hill. Someone who had won world championships, a little mature, but competent, obviously. And I was building, effectively, the cars for the next season. And in the production workshop, he came in and said, "What are you doing in here?" I said, "I'm building some Formula 2 cars. I'm not on the Formula 1 team. I've decided to go out my own." He said, "Well, nobody told me." He said, I thought you were going to be chief mechanic." I said, "No, Graham, I'm going to start my own thing." There was an initial look of, it's not how I expected it to be. And then he said, "Well, who's driving them?" I said, "Well, I've got 2 young guys that are paying." He said, "Well, would you like me to drive one of the cars?" So I said, "How can I pay you?" He said, "Well, we'll negotiate start money together. We'll pay good guy, bad guy. And as and when we get enough money that makes sense for me to race, we'll go 50-50. And off we went. And he drove the whole season. And actually, we were second in the first race, and we actually won the second race. And the standards, not just my standards, but the fact they were Formula 1 standards, perhaps enhanced by my own standards, were so much higher than anyone else in that category, that the team stood out. A lot of detail, spent the whole winter preparing, and then to have that success, and it coming from a group of mechanics that had basically formed themselves into a team. It started to really surprise people, and then the momentum started to get into it, and I started to grow so fast. At one point I had, 4 teams in different categories, racing different types of car, different mechanics, going in different directions, keeping growing my workshops and everything. And then at some point in the process, I started to count up, well, what are my assets? You start thinking materially, because obviously the opposite of a profit is a loss, and I didn't want to catch a cold. And then there was an oil crisis, and my principal sponsor was a French oil company that made one of the first synthetic oils, a company called Motul. And they just called me up and they said, "Well, the spot price has just gone through the floor, blah, 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 blah." So I'm going, oh my God, there was 5 minutes of prepping me, the inevitable, and therefore we've decided to stop. And we won't be fulfilling our contractual payments because we can't. And that pretty much brought me to my knees. It was hard, but I went to sort of family and friends mode. Managed to survive the year, so had an elegant end because my debt was greater than my assets, so I was technically insolvent. but I had completely underestimated the asset of my factory. And lo and behold, who should walk into my life again was Graham Hill, who said, I've decided to start my own Formula One team and it's a very late and I need an instant facility. Will you sell me your facilities? And whatever the number was, it was multiples more than I expected. And I was able to pay off everybody and have a relatively nominal sum of money left. But it was enough that I maintained my dignity, and I went home feeling pretty sad for myself. One particular night when most of the things had been, most of the things had been going wrong, and I thought, this is it. As a young person, you think you made it, and then equally fortuitously, someone who'd worked for me as in a marketing capacity, who had done a presentation with me to Philip Morris, and they didn't buy the presentation, but they actually took my marketing guy, and he had risen in stature through Philip Morris, and he reached out and said, I've got a bit of a challenge, do you want, I think you can help. So I said, what is it? He said, well, we have 2 drivers, and we're trying to ingratiate ourselves to the country that from where they originate. So this has sounded a little strange, and he said yes, and they're not bad. They're not bad drivers. They came 4th in Le Mans in a Porsche. I thought, 4th in Le Mans in a Porsche is like, so what sort of thing. I said, well, where are they from? He said, Ecuador. I thought, this is, here I am, world champions, and then these 2 individuals, come out of the woodwork. And I said, no, I'm not interested. I had to think about it. And I said, no, I can't go backwards. Well, you're not going backwards. Here's, you do everything, and we just pay. So I said, no, I'm not going to do it. Well, think about it. So 2 days went past, he phoned up, he said, look, Ron, I really have to find this. I have to find a solution. So I just thought of a number and multiplied it by 6, which was just an inconceivable amount of money, and I just sort of said, okay, I'll do it for this. He didn't even phone me back. He immediately said yes. Oh goodness. But of course it then gave me a significant amount of money to start again. So I said, right, it's 1 year of pain to put myself in a position to grow a business again, and really that's how it unfolded. I went to them and I said, McLaren's not doing very well, and I have this revolutionary car. I'm prepared to show it to you, but you have to be. You are in McLaren, but if I show it to you, so they had a senior manager called Dave Zelkovitz at the time, and he was a little bit geeky, and but really into motor racing. When we showed him the car, it was clear that he understood how this car could be revolutionary. And so we prepped a presentation to the Philip Morris board, and waited a couple of days. They phoned up and said, we're sorry, we can't go ahead, because effectively we just have too much money invested in McLaren as a brand, and effectively we have to continue, but we really think your car is amazing. Okay, how do I go about this? So a couple of days went past and I phoned up and I said, what about if I buy McLaren? So this is, how would you say, it was like a local pharmacy thinking about buying boots, or Evergreen, is that what it's called? Yeah, I think Evergreen. I said, no way this is, and they said, well, I mean, how would you like to go about that? I said, very easy. And I said, but you have to help. So they said, well, how do we help? I said, it's simple. You tell them if they don't sell me 50% of the company, you won't sponsor them. And so, I mean, it's a little bit crude to say that. It was a little more, it was more elegant, but that was the message. And then so they thought, well, what does this young guy know? And he's got the car and everything, and we'll have 50%, and we'll be able to, manoeuvre him out of the situation. But I then came up with another idea, which I said, look, we really want the most dynamic, forward-thinking racing team, and you've got all sorts of things that you say have value. So I don't need any of those things. So why don't we have a new factory, and I'll contribute my car, and you can only contribute the things that are going to make this team succeed. So our car was late, so we said, okay, I'll lease your old cars for 2 races. How much is that? That went in the pot. Then we'll have all your engines. I'll buy those, or the new company will buy them, etc., etc. And I was extremely, strong on not wanting anything but the very essence of what we needed to create a new team. There was even enough time to make new transporters for the cars, etc., etc. And of course, the value of their assets versus my assets was not hugely different. And I just had enough money to cover the difference, and that formed what was then a rebranded company from Team McLaren to McLaren International, and which had a different shareholder structure. We said we would evaluate where we were after 3 years and then decide what to do, but it never got that far. 2 years into the program, to Teddy Mayers, who was the principal behind the other 50%, and I both had clean desk policies. We never went home with anything left on the desk, and I came in on Monday morning as a single envelope with Ron written on it, And when I opened it, he said, "This isn't working for me. We need to talk." That was from Teddy Mayer. So I walked into his office and I said, "Teddy, got your note." I said, I don't really have a problem. I think we're doing great. I attracted some great sponsors on top of Philip Morris. The company was fiscally very strong, started to get results. But he was concerned that I was taking too much risk all the time. The risk at that moment was me pushing to commission Porsche to make a new turbo engine for us. And he didn't see how we can afford it. So, let's say a moment of entrepreneurial, I would say, brilliance, I said, okay. So he said, "What do you mean, okay?" I said, "I think one of us has to buy the other out, but you've started this process, so you determine the number, and I'll decide whether to buy or sell." And it was, put him in such a quandary. You could imagine if it was too cheap, I would buy. If it was too expensive, I wouldn't buy. But he had forgotten one thing, which was, my credibility was running very high with Philip Morris, and I think I was seen the architect of the rebirth of McLaren. And then so I sat and I thought, my goodness, it doesn't really what number he comes up with, I don't have it. So, as I mentioned earlier, I'd brought in some supplementary sponsors. So the overall budget was, let's say, 3/4 Philip Morris, 1/4 other sponsors that I'd brought into the team. So I came up with another entrepreneurial solution. I went to Philip Morris and I said, look, perhaps you'll not be surprised to know that we're in a bit of a deadlock in the company, and I don't really know who you want to run the company in the future, but it's going to be Teddy or it's going to be me, and if it's Teddy, I have to sell. Oh no, we want, definitely want you. You're the architect of the current situation. We believe in you. So I said, well, I need some help. But I said, well, how can we help? I said, well, here's all the contracts. I said, when we started this contractual arrangement, my budget was completely covered by your contract, and I've now developed 25% more income. I want you to forward pay me that 25% out of your contract in one lump sum, but I want you to do it, this might not be the date, I want you to do it on the 23rd of June. 23rd of June, I have to have the money, and I need to know categorically that I'm going to get the money. We discussed a mechanism. They came back and they said, okay, we'll do it. They said, are you sure you're going to have enough money? I said, 100%. I will be able to continue, but I need this acceleration of payment. So then I went to my bank. I can't remember what the numbers were, but it was a lot of money. I said, the banker was still the traditional type of bank manager. His name was Mr. Hermson. Up until that moment, if I'd had a dog, I would have called it Hermson, and I would have kicked it quite frequently because Mr. Hermson was never very user-friendly. And I sat in front of him and I said, Mr. Hermson, I'll come. He said, I'd like to borrow some money. I said, how much do you want to borrow? I said, whatever the number was, £1.5 million. So he looked pretty motionless. I said, but before you answer, I said, I want to borrow it for 24 hours. And I will give you a guarantee that you will be paid 24 hours after. So I set the whole deal up. And for tax reasons, the deal was executed in Estoril, Portugal. It was complicated because of all the history of companies and this and that and the other. So there was a table full of documents. And all I could see in Teddy's face was he wanted to see whose name was on the cheque. And I'd already preempted that. So all the documents got signed. Two lawyers sort of met and said, okay, all the documents, okay, payment, boom, and then he had a bank cheque, just a guaranteed cheque, cashier's cheque, as it were. I could see the disappointment in his eyes, because maybe he'd even thought at that stage. And I knew he thought how I'd raised the money, but I hadn't raised it at all that way. And that stayed a deep secret with me. That was the first time I've ever really spoken about it. This is 1982, 30 odd years ago. The world was very different then. But it was, again, everybody really won. He had a payment that was beyond his wildest hopes. I owned briefly 100% of the company because I quickly sold some shares to refinance my life. And that was really the biggest breakthrough. 1982, I emerged in, effectively complete control of the company. I had partners, but they were very silent partners. By and large, those 2 or 3 things that I've described were the absolute catalyst to having the commercial horsepower to play in that league. B, having, I built a good reputation in those first 3 or 4 years of Grand Prix racing. My passion and enthusiasm for car racing was ignited by visiting a motor racing event of all days, Boxing Day. Boxing Day was a sports day traditionally in England, and that means that uncharacteristically, it doesn't happen now, but there was an event at a circuit called Brands Hatch in Kent that I went to with my brother at a very early age. I was certainly sort of in early teens, and of course the noise, the smell, it sort of triggered the adrenaline rush, and I sort of hankered after getting involved in the sport. But of course it was a little bit like going up a flight of stairs and then suddenly deciding you wanted to climb Everest. It was for me incomprehensible that I would find a way into motorsport, be it ultimately enter Formula One at a relatively young age. I was forever taking things apart, not always being able to put them back together again, all the normal frustrations. But I was fascinated by how things work, and still do. I mean, people now ask me, what cars do I own, and do I like cars and things like that. So I see the surprise on their face, and I actually say, well, I actually don't like cars, and they go into shock, and they say, no, you're joking. I said, no, I like making things, and I'm extremely competitive, and therefore motor racing provided the ability to make things, and very advanced cars that had to be compliant to complex regulations. And then I loved the sport of racing and the entrepreneurial aspects of motor racing, because of course if you're in a business that constantly loses money, then you're not going to survive. So it's pretty challenging to make money in a world-class sport. Very few people do it, even in the sport, let alone in other sports. Yeah, school holiday sort of thing, trying to peek through the windows and the doors, and then generally getting in the way, and probably found it easier to give me something to do rather than constantly asking me to get out of the way. And so all the normal things that you would expect a young chap to do: make tea, clean things, generally be a bit of a dog's body, but again, it was just being close to Grand Prix cars. And at that time there were only 2 races televised. So one being the British Grand Prix, and the other, strange enough, being the American Grand Prix. I think televised sport, even in Europe at that early period, was unusual. We only had 2 television channels when I was growing up, and that commercial television hadn't really hit the UK. So it took some time before there was the airtime for sport, but America was more progressive and more channels. So obviously, televising the American Grand Prix was something that they did, and of course then they could sell it back into the European markets. And then I think the next on the calendar was Monte Carlo, and then slowly it built from there to being a very much revenue generating part of Grand Prix racing. These two individuals, both from Australia, were quite meticulous in how they went about preparing the cars. I learnt from them and other individuals who were participating in motorsport really the difference between good and great. And great to me is linked into perfection, and of course there is no such thing as perfection. But if you're a sort of obsessive compulsive as I am, which I'd like to feel manifests itself in attention to detail, you just absolutely become a sponge to people who can actually show you a better way to do something. And so I tried to build my career on perfection, and inevitably, as you try and absorb knowledge, that desire and thirst normally means that it actually takes every conscious minute of your day. So you become extremely focused, extremely dedicated. And to be focused and dedicated, you have to be full of passion. And so my passion for everything that I was involved in was extreme. There was no room for girlfriends in my life until, really early 20s. And there was no opportunity to spend money. So virtually I saved everything I made, primarily because I didn't socialise, because I was always at work. And it just gave me not only a strong work ethic, but it was a work ethic that was recognised by people that appreciated what I was trying to do. And that really accelerated me at a very early age into the higher echelons of motor racing. I was at technical college. Most of our technical colleges now have become universities, but they had sort of vocational courses that gave you a qualification. So there was a process by which you, if you pursued it through to the end, you had effectively what was called a higher national diploma in a specific discipline. Mine was automotive technology, and needless to say, it was to be great and to emerge with a good qualification required a level of commitment that I just didn't have the time for. And then in 1966, my life dramatically changed when the enthusiasm and commitment and passion was recognised by the team manager of the company, which was not Brabham at that time, it was Cooper's that I had subsequently started to work for. And he very amusingly did something which I will never ever forget, which is, the company was probably approximately about 100 people. And a Grand Prix team was 6 to 8 people. And it was a little like football. They posted who was the players for the event, in this instance, who were the team members. And so the first I knew was there was a bulletin on a company notice board saying this is the team for forthcoming Mexico City race, the Mexican Grand Prix. And my name was on it, and it was on headed paper, and I didn't even think for 1 minute that someone was playing a practical joke, because there was no really sophistication in photocopying machines. Today you could have easily spoofed someone into believing that it was, a rather poor taste joke, but it was real. And I think there was a silence over quite a large part of the company that I, at a relatively young age, I think I was 19 at the time, it was 1966, was going to the Mexican Grand Prix. And you know, at that point of my life, you know, my parents had put a roof over my head and they'd fed me, but they weren't wealthy. I was, you know, middle class family, but not really. Let's say they weren't in a position to further my career. They were in a position to feed me and clothe me, and you know, part of my salary went back into the household, normal way things were in that period. And of course, not only did I not have time to go on holiday, but holidays were just forget. I never had holidays, and therefore I'd never even thought about leaving the country. I don't think that I'd even been further than the Isle of Wight, and then suddenly I'm on a 707, primarily going to New York, because I didn't have the range to go to Mexico City and via New York. And I mean, I can still remember the emotion of being sat in a jet, going to New York on the way to Mexico City. It was quite a surreal experience, and of course the determination that I had to try and excel at the event was extreme. And actually, whilst the car that I was preparing didn't do very well, it was driven by a local hero. One of their other cars won the Grand Prix, so it was particularly satisfying that there I was, you know, at a Grand Prix which the team actually won. I was a workaholic, and you weren't really considered a motor racing person if you didn't have the ability to work, you know, straight through one night and work the next day. So 2 days with no, you know, a sort of 48 hours with no sleep was just called an all-nighter, and you know, people would almost wear all-nighters like a medal. I never had anything to spend my money on, but the one thing I did always had, I had great cars. So I was in my 20s. I had an E-Type Jaguar, in which I was constantly being stopped by the police, because the police couldn't accept that someone so young could have an E-Type Jaguar. But nevertheless, I did, and I stopped at some traffic lights and went to sleep. And the person beeped behind me, reputedly, and I drove diagonally straight into a lamppost. And in those days, no seat belts. The steering wheel penetrated one of my lungs, but more importantly, this was in the early days of what was then called laminated screens. It wasn't a triplex screens that fractionized into lots of components, and I went through the windscreen and cut a large section of my head open. I mean, my whole forehead and everything, and a phenomenal amount of cuts on my face. But more importantly, I got glass in both of my eyes. And again, I was very fortunate. I was near a hospital that had some of the best eye surgeons and also plastic surgeons. It was actually there to accommodate serious operations. It was a sort of a centralised, specialised hospitals that people weren't taken to normally in an A&E condition. And I was very lucky. I had two things. The eye surgeon was amazing, and the plastic surgeon did a pretty good job. And when I came to, I was laying flat on the bed, and nurses came and doctor came very quick, and they said, look, you've suffered severe damage to your eyes, and you may not know that anything you do, move an arm, move a leg, everything puts pressure on your eyes. So you have to lay very still, and this is going to take time. So I said, how long? They said, well, we don't want to take the bandages off for several days. We're not too sure when. We want to see how everything else. So I was laid very still, and there was someone in the next bed who had a condition, and as a result of this condition, he had surgery. And he too was laying very still. And X days into the experience, with my sisters, my mother, everybody coming and being pretty upset, I'd met a girl in France and she'd come back to England, and so this was not without, that moment of time was not without its complications. And when they unwrapped the bandages of this person next to me, the operation had been unsuccessful. So I had the stress of him then laying in bed, and you could hear him crying. I never met him. He had left before I had my own bandages removed. And my eyesight was pretty good. But I was still covered in lacerations, to the extent that when I went to my local bar on the first day of coming out of hospital, the barmaid fainted because I obviously was looking pretty cut up. Anyway, things healed over time, but because of the eye operation, they just said you can't physically work for 3 months. You got to take 3 months off. I was doing everything, with my own first team, and I hired people, and then suddenly realised that the productivity was much higher if I was delegating responsibility. So that accident pushed me into management by necessity, and it was sort of life-changing in many ways. And I still, in certain circumstances, I still feel I still get pain from where the wood rim steering wheel penetrated my lung. I can still occasionally feel it, but by and large, and of course you suddenly realise that you're not so as immortal as you think you are as a young person. And I'm now slightly over 70. I've never broken a bone in my body, and I've never had any really serious illness. And again, back to America, I go to the Mayo Clinic every 2 years for my 5,000 mile service. And it's something I really believe in. It's I'm a great believer in you looking after yourself, but not just physically working out, but really understanding your physiology and the risks and how you minimise the risks. So right now, I'm working on my 20-year plan, with no certainty that it will be 20 years, but I think that if you have a 20-year plan, you can sort of get over the emotion that I experienced far too frequently, which is you get up in the morning and you've had a shower, you stand in front of the mirror, you close your eyes, you feel 35, 40, you open your eyes and reality hits you straight there. The mind is still full of ambition, but the body is not actually following on. But if you want to get the best out of it, you got to look after it. So that's what I try desperately to do. At the point at which I closed the previous organisation, I had really just said it to all the people, I'm stopping. So as elegantly as possible, I was on my own. So I had a completely clean piece of paper, which is always very scary when you have infinite choice. A quantity of money that I knew was going to be there at the end of the year, so I started to plan. and managed to get everything back on track. So from there, I started to look at Formula One. There's a particular project that BMW had initiated, which again, they came to me in desperation. They were keen to accelerate a program that had fallen behind, and I was able to negotiate a really great contract with them. And it gave me enough money to build a Formula One car. And I needed to find someone to design it. And there was a young English designer who had actually designed, he'd previously worked at McLaren and Lola, there are two British racing car companies. He'd been headhunted by American who owned a company called Chaparral. And so he designed this Indianapolis car. One of the things about this individual, John Barnard, was that he was notorious for seeking perfection, which inevitably meant programs were late. So the first car went to the Indianapolis tests, and he stayed behind to finish the second car, spare parts, etc. The car was very successful in testing, but by the time he arrived in America, and not having been there to be interviewed or to be correctly positioned as being the effectively responsible for this car's design, those people who had financed it had, I think, got a little bit over their skis and were claiming a greater involvement in the design than was true. So this really angst John Barnard. He was pretty upset and quickly returned to England after the Indianapolis race, having resigned because of this lack of appreciation and the fact that he designed such a successful car. He didn't live far from me, and I phoned him and I said, I wonder, would you have some time to meet me? He said, yes. I went to his home. And to this day, I will remember when he opened the door, knocked on the door, there was a delay. And he eventually came to the door, and he was in carpet slippers and he had an electric drill in his hand. He said, come in. He looked agitated. And I said, everything okay, John? I didn't know him very well. He said, I've just been putting up a kitchen. And he says, I've drilled a hole through one of the cupboards, and now there's a hole on the finished surface. And I looked and I thought, oh my goodness, I would be irritated. So I said, oh, John, doesn't matter. You can get these little plastic things, you put it in, and in a couple of days you won't even notice it. He said, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to leave the hole exposed so that it reminds me on a daily basis that I made a mistake. And I thought, this guy's A, going to be difficult, and B, he's got the same attention to detail as I have. And then we forged a partnership. He came to the company, I built a drawing office for him and started to fund the program. And of course, until you make anything, it's really the designer's time, it's paper, it's brain power, etc., etc. And there were several historic moments in that early Formula One program. There was there were two technologies that we initiated. One was the ability to simulate a car moving over the road surface, which was called a moving road. And John teamed with one of the universities, and it was a sort of breakthrough at being able to develop the aerodynamics of a racing car, because the car was effectively not static in the wind tunnel floor was moving under it, and same as the wind speed, so it meant that the accuracy of the aerodynamic development was much greater. But the other breakthrough was the program that I touched on with BMW. The rear aerofoil on the car was made from carbon fibre, a relatively simple profile and really it had, it wasn't complex in shape. And he was looking at this, and this rear aerofoil was really the embryonic component made from carbon fibre, and he was saying, with all the forces that we're developing aerodynamically, we need a really stiff primary structure. It's called the monocoque. He said, I think we could make one out of this material. So I said, okay, this is pretty difficult, but of course within 2-3 weeks we both become pretty up to speed with composites, and it was just so depressing. Everywhere we went, we struggled to find the maturity of a manufacturing process to be able to make a monocoque out of this material. We went to Westlands, who were manufacturing helicopter rotor blades. We went to British Aerospace, as they were known then, and virtually everything was everything made from composite was just playing to its weight as opposed to playing to its strength. So it was used to drop the weight out of cowlings and non-structural components. So again, the technology wasn't very mature. So we were close to giving up. And then an American that John knew gave him a ring, and he said, I used to work for this company in America. They make rocket engines, and they were starting to look at composites for solid propellant rockets. And he said they're called Hercules, and they're in Salt Lake City. So I was on the phone in a millisecond, and by this time we had a model of the car, a big model. It was like 3 feet long, 4 feet long maybe. So this model was boxed up, checked in as hand luggage. We arrived in Salt Lake City, and we went to Hercules. Here was I expecting to drive up to a sort of NASA-like environment, and always looking at is all these small buildings dotted around what was the salt flats, or very barren area. It was distinctly unimpressive, but nevertheless, it was extremely difficult to get through the security. So 2 things occurred. First of all, a lot of their facilities were subterranean, and secondly, they quickly pointed out that if anything went wrong in any of their facilities, it was going to be one almighty explosion, and therefore most of their facilities were spread at relatively large distances between each other. And it was quite strange because it had a little bit of a James Bondy feel to it, subterranean, immaculately clean, because that was a requirement of working in composites. And very quickly we hit a brick wall. And they said, one of the problems we've got is all our contracts are military and the space program. And even that they were vague about. Wasn't too difficult to work out when you're seeing missiles all over the place in part form. So I said, well, you're very secret. He said, yeah, we're extremely secret. And I said, don't you find that frustrating? That you can't tell the world how wonderful you are as a company and how advanced you are in material sciences. And they said, it is a bit frustrating. So I said, well, why don't you do this Formula One car, and then you'll have something that you can promote, and you can come to the Grand Prix with your customers. You won't be breaching any of the confidentiality clauses or secrecy clauses that relate to your contracts. You'll be able to have a profile. And the key engineers have egos like you can't believe, a lot of self-belief, and they don't often get the spotlight on them. You could see them mentally punching the air, and then they helped coerce the management, and off we went. And so the first structure, the first carbon fibre car that ever went into Formula One was a McLaren, and it was in fact not a McLaren. It was my company, which was then called Project 4. I never gave names to the companies, I just gave them designations in order to give the accolade of success to the sponsors. So it was just my company's Project 1, Project 2, Project 3, etc. So that way, Project 4. So we're trying to build this car, and of course, one of the most expensive cars ever made, being made by someone that didn't have much money. Then the thing that happens always in motor racing, when you start winning, your power base starts to increase. And there was no question, that I was an incredible thorn in lots of people's sides. I rocked the establishment in many, many ways. And, from occasionally feeling the crosshairs of the competition, how do we shoot this guy? How do we basically bring him down, as it were? Because the media puts you on the pedestal, your competition is constantly trying to take you off the pedestal. And if you wobble, then the media and the competition is sort of keen to jump all over you. And I was, dodging and ducking, and let's say the crosshairs didn't fall that frequently. But the more you win, the more that people come along and say, you're destroying the sport. And actually, one day, I received a phone call from the president of Philip Morris then, Aliardo Buzzi, of Europe. And he said, Ron, he said, he's my principal sponsor. He said, you're winning too many races. They were sponsoring Ferrari. And I need you to think about the situation, because it's really becoming impossible, and you're ruining the sport. I've been extremely polite. And he said, Ron, I said, will you consider what I say? I said, absolutely, Aliardo. You know how much respect I have for your opinion, and I will give it deep consideration. You must give me some time. Of course, Ron, take as long as you want. So I put the phone down. I thought for a few seconds, and I said, you must be joking, but I'll think about it for 5 or 6 years. And of course, inevitably, as in any winning streak or period of success, in any team, in any sport, things happen that your vision isn't there for that particular swerve, and you fall in a hole. But it was, the thing that I feel I brought to McLaren and the growth of McLaren was my absolute aversion to debt. I hated debt. I would always, I didn't even like having an overdraft. I would say, and my various CFOs, my first CFO, a guy called Bob Illman, he was a debt averse too. And that was easy. But then at some point I as he retired, I took another CFO. This CFO was more modern in his thinking and was constantly arguing, debt's good as long as it's the right amount of debt. So I would always argue endlessly about how much debt we had. And for years, he never won the argument because we always had such a strong bank balance. And then I realised the thing to do was separate off that bank balance and use it for diversification, and to let the Grand Prix team carry enough debt that it was always seen as only just making a profit. And of course, the wisdom for me was every year you posted accounts. If you were a Grand Prix team and you posted accounts with lots of profit, all your sponsors would immediately have an appetite for pushing down the price. So with careful planning, what I built was a fund which was initially designed for growth and diversification, and then I came up with the idea of buying a building, a really prestigious headquarters. And the headquarters for me was, and I explained it to my shareholders, I said, look, don't look at this as a headquarters. Look at this as our advertising budget. As people come to our headquarters and they see standards that I think I can impose onto our organisation, they will realise that we're going to have a cutting edge approach to everything we do. So they said, well, what's it going to look like? So I thought for a while, I said, I can't tell you. You can't tell us, no. But I can put a thought into your mind which will help you. So they said, what is it? I said, it's called mental aftertaste. So they look at me. I only invented the expression a few seconds before. So they said, what's mental aftertaste? I said, okay, when you visited this place and you've driven away and you're half a mile from the facility, these people are going to talk, and what they're going to say is going to describe 90% automotive NASA and 10% Disney. So this is the feeling they're going to have. They're going to be blown away by what they see. And that was it. I sought visionary architects. I didn't really know too much about architecture. I bought every book. I looked at all the things that had been built. And I narrowed down the architectural choice to 6. I phoned the architects and said, would they be interested in building a headquarters? They all said yes. I said, I would like to come and visit you. I visited all of these architects, and I said, I want to go and see your best building and your worst building. And I said, it's very, very important to me. I want to meet the person in charge of the building. That's who I want to talk to. So they said, well, of course, these are all occupied, but we can talk to our clients. And I said, this is nothing. I'll sign confidentiality agreements, I don't care, but I want to be able to really understand how well the building works. Well, and they didn't say this, but every one of them resisted me going to see the worst building. But that's what I did. And when I met the building manager, I wasn't interested in meeting the building managers of the inferior buildings. I wanted to see the building managers of their best building. I then say, as they're showing me their reception, I said, look, don't worry about this. I've seen everything. I've studied. I want to go into the heart of the building. I want to go into the mechanical and electrical systems. I want to understand. I want to look in the lift shafts. I want to look in, I want to see behind the scenes. And I had looked at everything and been to what was the Getty Museum, which was just being finished by Richard Meyer. I met Richard, and he looked a bit weary. But I met his project manager. The project manager was really switched on, and I spoke to Richard and said, you know, I'm a bit worried about the distance between our two countries. And he said, well, you know, New York to LA is further than New York to England, or close on it. So he said, I've been running the LA program and we speak English, blah, blah, blah. So I said, okay, what about your senior project manager? I want him on my project because I'm buying into some of the qualities and standards and aesthetics of the Getty Museum. He said, yeah, no problem. So I said, okay. And I'd met with several other architects, and you know, part of the evaluation is, did they have the capacity? So the top architects were full of work, but Richard obviously come out of this big project, so he had resource. So I balanced everything up, thought, you know, I know what I want, so no one's going to impose a building on me. But more importantly, you know, I want a top class architect because I want to hit an aesthetic target, which I don't even have defined yet. And then I started to worry about time change. So I said to Richard, you know, Richard, I said, I'm ready to go, but I really need to see this is going to work. So let's sign an agreement, but after 3 months, if it's not working, I want to be able to escape. He said, I can't do that. I said, you know, so. I said, well, what about if I pay you $250,000 after 3 months, if I'm not happy? So he said, okay, you know, and reluctantly. And I said, but I want to be fair, you know, I mean, this is what I've bought. And I listed down the things, project manager, blah, 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 you know, same as Getty Museum. A month into it, I suddenly realised that the project manager's wife has started to put pressure. You know, I've just been living the fact that you're going backwards and forwards to LA, now you're going backwards and forwards to England. You know, you kept telling me, you know, that you would be returning to New York and blah, blah, blah. Guy, understandably, didn't want to jeopardise his marriage, you know, and so after, let's say, fumbling around in a conversation, Richard said, you know, there's no point in having someone that doesn't want to do this, and I've got this guy. And I said, okay, hold on a second, you know, I don't know how to measure this. And anyway, you know, it didn't go well. Richard was elegant and very professional. I don't know what the settlement was, but it was less than $250,000. He was disappointed, I was disappointed. But immediately I went for what was really not a second choice, but a choice that became second because of capacity. I went to Norman and said, Norman, you know, I love your work, but you know, you really got the capacity, and can I have some senior people? So I'm going to give you these people. So he listed the people, all of whom became partners of the business following the success of the project, and and the lead architect is in fact on my project, has subsequently become the lead architect in the practice. So there's a friendship and a respect that has come out of that program. We're now working on I built another factory with them, now I'm working on another project with them. And the journey was, on that facility, was truly amazing because I was a very unique customer. You know, meetings every week. I mean, there was something like 2,000 odd meetings. And I was driving the program every time we came to a problem, we found solutions. I used some of our own design resource on some of the things I wanted to do. And ultimately, the building was complete. And we did a phase occupation. And I remember it was a very unusual thing. I didn't want people distracted, so that I think it was 4 people from McLaren and myself, and said, everybody else, you're not involved. These 4 people are the only people that are involved. So for years, I worked with these 4 people. Of course, there was a degree of resentment coming from senior people that I hadn't involved them. And but I exposed it progressively, got them into my way of thinking. But then there was a lot of people that said, it's too big. You're going to depersonalise the business. You're going to do this, and you're going to do that. So I listened and coached and massaged everybody and then there was a hardcore. So I got the hardcore negatives together and I said, look, it's pretty simple. This is the date we're moving in. Just assume that that's the date that the train is leaving the station. You're either on it or you're off it. But there's no wishy-washy. I'm not even prepared for you to go and try it out. You're either 100% committed, everything, of a handful, I think 90%. I don't think more than 1 person, maybe 2 people left. And of course, there's a work expands into time available, if you've heard that expression. But actually, people expand into buildings so fast. They think, how did we ever manage, and then within 1 or 2 years, even though I tried to future-proof it, we were bursting at the seams again. And then within 10 years, I'm building another factory, having tried to optimise and optimise and shoehorn and increase the density of the people, density of desks, all this sort of thing. And when you go back to the very early 1980s, we were less than 70 people when we formed what was a McLaren International. And, we were quickly 1,000, then 1,500, then 2,000, 2016 when I effectively took the final decision and entered into what was unpleasant negotiations with my shareholders on exit price with 3,500. And that was a journey again, the company bursting at the seams, and I wanted to grow the company. So not only did I have a phenomenally strong desire to stop on my 70th birthday, primarily driven by I saw no benefit in dying at my desk or going into some inefficiency either through lack of commitment or tiredness or thing, and I wanted to do other things. And so really all the way through my career, from beginning to the very end, and my career is not over, I was always very much thinking of the vision, thinking of the way forward. And my vision for the company started to be very different to my other shareholders, who were still fixated and are fixated on being a Grand Prix team, whereas I've always wanted to be a technology company. Your vision comes at different times and places. If you go back to the early part of my story, started with lying beside the swimming pool in Acapulco, but those moments with different thought processes just constantly. If you're a serial entrepreneur, this is the way your mind works. And if you get exhausted and you say, I'm going to carve some time out, and you sort of change something and you create 10% capacity in your life by stopping something, it would be days before you filled it with something else. You don't ever stop, and I am difficult. Difficult to be with, difficult to live with, and but I do try and channel my, let's say, personality traits into business, which of course made me somewhat, you like me or hate me. It's a bit like the Marmite, probably a product that you don't know, but there's one of the few products in the world is actually marketed on the basis of you either love it or hate it, sort of thing. Sort of English expression, not my cup of tea. So but that reputation, which I fully accept, really came from not being able to tolerate people who didn't share my vision or didn't really understand why we did things. I live very close to the factory. My father commuted to London, and it took him 2.5 hours out of his day, and I watched it for years, and I said, there's no way ever am I going to put myself in a situation where I'm spending 2.5 hours of my day on travelling to and from work. So I've wanted to build my facilities close to my home. The problem, and I'll come back to your question shortly, is that you don't have enough time to decompress. So your family gets, you're not where you need to be. You're still at work when you get home, sort of thing. And just to finish on that, and in order to maybe some of your young entrepreneurs pick this point up, is I strongly recommend that if you find yourself in a short travel time, that you get into a ritual of getting home, having a shower, changing your clothes. Not to have the shower, change your clothes, but basically you have to decompress. If you go in and start downloading into your family your pressures at work, if you take your work into your family life, you are going to damage your family life. And in the end, you have to have priorities in life, and those people close to you are the most important people. You've got 2 customers called Grand Prix drivers. You are constrained, you can't multiply the number of teams, you are permitted to have 1 team, and the economic model of that team, plus or minus, is going to be fall somewhere, if you want to be competitive, between 200, 300 million pounds a year. You're never going to get the revenue either side of it. You can run in a Grand Prix racing and compete for less than 100 million, but if you want to be competitive, then you have to be in a position to spend 200 to 300 million pounds a year. So last year, the group of companies combined turnovers 920 million pounds. So if you look at the model, where does the other 600 odd million pounds come from? And that's through diversification. The first moment was actually as I was walking amongst the company, and I'd been looking at figures, and I suddenly realised all this R&D spend for these 2 guys. There's so much we know that can actually be monetised. But of course, you knock on someone's door and say, "Do you think we can help you?" And they say, "Oh yeah, but you're a Grand Prix team." I say, no, but you don't understand, of course. Getting people of the same thought process. So then inadvertently and coincidentally, initially the New Zealand America's Cup team some years ago came and said, "Explain composites to us." I'm fiercely patriotic, but they're the only people that came and talked. So we talked and explained. They went away. They didn't have any money. And it just planted a seed. And then suddenly we were approaching the Olympic Games, and I thought, you know what? Why don't we see if we can influence? We influence the outcome of some of our teams. The government had constructed a concept of a national lottery and allocated funds to the Olympic Games we had very small amounts of money. I think whatever the money was, I spent 4 times that amount. And because people got passionate, they were doing even more than they should have done inside the company and sort of inevitably keeping it from me, but that's not a problem. And we focused on rowing, cycling, and sailing. And actually, we actually focused on the Winter Olympics in bobsleighs and loos and the skeleton, and we focused on rowing and cycling, and brought lots of things to bear. A lot of data acquisition. The data acquisition allowed you to be able to tell the athlete what you just did was what you should have done, and what you did about then is what you know. So if you know what's good, and you can get muscle memory. So I think the biggest impact we had was on our cyclists and analysing cyclists. Although we instrumented the oars, so the oars on the teams were full of electronics, so that we were able to measure all the forces, who was rowing the strongest, and maybe change the positioning in the boat, but more importantly, optimise the technique. And as we started to get the results, and I'm just saying, right, now we can tell the world what we've done in different ways. Either the athletes or the federations or the committee came and said, yeah, but we want to keep this secret so that we can take it to the next Olympic Games with an advantage. Which, of course, wasn't the plan, because I needed to publicise the performance of the team and the performance of our company. So, to be honest, we sort of listened to them, but we still talked to people who were trying to convince to invest in us. And 2 or 3 companies really came to the party and started to exploit predictive analytics, some of our manufacturing techniques, how we shortened time to market, how we ensured that our supply chain was optimised. Most people wait for the product to arrive at their doorstep before determining whether it was to spec. Sometimes it really pays to go upstream so that your supplier is guided. And all of these techniques we brought to bear, and this business started to flourish. In parallel to that, we'd had a brief foray into building what was called the F1, which is now an iconic car. 20 years ago, set so many records and standards, and gave birth to a very competitive race car, which won Le Mans. But never really economically viable. It was actually the racing program that eventually generated the revenue to make the program break even, but the road car side was going to lose money. Again, we got the timing wrong. We brought an exotic car to the market in a depression, as it were. But then we got more serious. I had, in switching our alliance to Mercedes-Benz, we made a precondition that they assisted us in getting into that car market, and they swerved a little bit, which gave birth to the McLaren SLR, which was a sort of a hybrid McLaren Mercedes sports car, which we made a little over 2,000 of. And then we started on a program to make our own car company. Mercedes postured. They were having their own problems in various ways, as companies do. So we spun the company off because they wanted to be convinced that we weren't bleeding motor racing money into our production program. And so these things became ring-fenced. It was advantageous in many ways. First of all, I realised the culture in each of these companies needed to be different. You can't put motor racing people in a production, a program, and you can't, and as we developed our electronics and analytics business, these were people who need to be passionate about different disciplines. And mixing them in the staff restaurant was fine. That allowed us to maintain the sort of McLaren DNA, but they needed to be separated culturally. And of course that gave us independent fiscal reporting so we could see where the profits and losses came. But even in the worst moments, I was saying, do not get distracted by Formula One. You know, if we want our company to be truly great, we have to continue to invest in our technology businesses, grow the technology businesses. We need more facilities and we must go in that direction. My other shareholders were fixated on returning to competitiveness in Formula One as fast as possible, irrespective of cost. And I just didn't agree. And coupled with that was, you know, if a senior person who's running the operation is in disagreement, then inevitably they seek second level management's opinion. There is a huge difference between being at a poker table with cash and poker table with chips when you haven't financed the chips. So the mindset of second level management is different. You're not playing with your money. And this is, you know, the great entrepreneurs, no matter how big their companies are, they are extremely aware of how the money functions in the organisation. Where is the wastage and then where are the people? And of course, you know, we've seen endless programs and companies in the world fall over because of poor direction. And then came one specific thing, and again, it's going to come to everybody in business. You start to realise that mortality is looming, and you start to think about, well, you know, how do I want to play it out? So 2-3 years ago, I started to communicate with my shareholders that A, I didn't want to die at my desk, and B, I didn't want to leave my money in the company. And of course, 3 years out is a lifetime in motor racing, and you know, I started to try to blend it into State of the Nation letters that I would write to them, and then inevitably, you know, as it looms, the issue, there's a reality, you know, they don't necessarily, you get disagreement, and then irrespective of all successes and all monetary gains that have been enjoyed, you get into a very hard-nosed, you know, maths game, you know, negotiation, which sort of discolours a little bit the end game. When you find yourself sat with people and the only thing that you're really talking about is money, and then inevitably to temper the end number, there has to be some sort of attempt at surgically demonstrating why the number is this or why the number is that. Inevitably it just gets super uncomfortable. But in the end, I was delighted with the outcome. I applied one of my experiences in life to the whole process, which I'd learned from Senna. When I negotiated his first retainer with the company, which was a 3-year, 2-year option contract, and it was intense. He was living in a rented home in Isha, which was about half an hour's drive from the company, and I was going backwards and forwards, and he of course was playing, well, I've got this option and that option. And I was saying, yes, but you want to drive for us, and blah, blah, blah. And we came to a hard point, and the hard point was, financial difference. And he was very religious. Had strong beliefs, not in, he just was, he believed in God, he believed in values and principles. And of course, he believed in the will of God. I was rather mischievous in arriving at the point where we were apart, but conceding was going to damage the relationship. So I thought, and I said, well, why don't we toss a coin for it? His English wasn't perfect at the time, so I had to draw a picture of the head and a picture of the tail. And I said, what will be, will be. Whatever was out there that can influence this outcome, it's a greater force and things. So, you've clearly got something maybe that will favour you, but I'm more of a fatalist, and so why don't we go down this path? He immediately grasped the fact that the outcome was not going to be the result of one person conceding. And actually the money wasn't the point. And at the time, and now, I'm deeply respectful of money. And I wouldn't be flippant, I'm never flippant. But this was the way to break the deadlock. The coin flew into the air. It hit a brown shag pile carpet in which we stood and shot under the curtain, and didn't have the rattle that conveyed to me that it was going to be flat. As he reached for the curtain, I said, stop. I said, this may be not completely flat, it has to be completely flat. So we lift up the curtain very slowly, and there is the coin completely flat. It was for the first 3 years, he'd forgotten the multiple of 3. And it was some number around $300,000. So we'd flicked a coin. At the time it went into the air, both of us were thinking this is $300,000. By the time it came to a standstill, I realised it was $1 million. I doubt whether anyone's ever flicked a coin for $1 million. But the bit that was relevant to this negotiation, to my recent experiences, was I'd put him in a situation where all he thought about 24/7 was the negotiation. I was going back to the company and running the company with all the other things. And I thought, if this is going to be the end game, I will think about nothing else. And that will give me some benefit in the discussions. And then was a point where I think fairness became more relevant. People appreciated this wasn't very elegant, some principal shareholder. But it was too late. It was not too late to ensure that everything was properly done, but it was too late to carry the emotion, the negativity out of it. But I look back on it as one of my best negotiations ever. The outcome was, I believe, fair, and I'm thinking very carefully about what to do. The only thing that I've definitely decided to do is live in England. And of course, the options are available to English people to minimise tax by moving countries. I'm an English person and I'm patriotic, and I'd rather be here. I love the weather. I love the diversification of our weather, and of course I'm in the position where I can go to the sun if the sun's somewhere other than England. When people come to me and they ask about drivers, how did I choose that driver? How did I choose this driver? What is the greatest quality of any driver? Of course, they quickly understand that the abilities of drivers need to be different from one era to another. Fangio possibly could have driven a modern car, but most likely not. But the common denominator, and it became more relevant over the last 15, 20 years, top of the line comment, sacrifice. If you want to be the best in something, in our world, everything has to come second. There are some challenges because Grand Prix drivers start so young, and it's such an intensive process of karting, etc., etc. It's to the detriment of their education. So, as they mature into world champions, they're not always as clever and as worldly as they needed to be, and that's unfortunately part of the sacrifice, but it's never too late. Smart ones quickly realise that they need to be more switched on about contracts and things like that, so they reinvent themselves. But it's a challenging world that we live in at the moment, but it's still a world that does respond well to a dedicated entrepreneur. Well, first of all, risk has been minimised. The chances of you hurting yourself in a Grand Prix car just statistically are so much better than they've ever been. Advent of carbon fibre, structural analysis, finite element analysis, things that can actually predict the performance of a structure under high forces, greater and greater regulatory control. All of these things sort of give a driver, doesn't really matter what's going to happen, I'm going to walk away from it. And that's pretty much has been the case. Most drivers that have been injured in the last 10 years, there's some freak relevance. A component falls off another car, bounces down the track and hits Massa on the head. Statistically, just you would think could never happen. And most injuries fall into that category, or a car failure, and that's all about the competence of the company and the team. The smaller teams, they wrestle to comply to the regulations sometimes because it requires lots of testing and structural analysis. But generally it's a very safe sport, and if you rank it against rugby, horse racing, there's just two. Miles safer. Yeah, I mean, if you want to have a head injury, that's likely to carry in the later life, you're better off as a boxer than you are a rugby player. Rugby is things, and American football is the same. I like to think that I, along with other people, did a great deal to make Formula One safer, and that's cascaded down. Who would have known when I sat in Salt Lake City and was convincing these individuals to give us technology that pretty much every car, racing car in the world, is made from carbon fibre. And we are the biggest producers of carbon fibre sports cars. We have a USP on that basis. So I think that at some point in the future, people may wake up to what John Barnard, the designer, he opened my eyes to the feasibility, and I made it commercially possible, and the whole thing starts like I think there's a lot of things that I look back on in Grand Prix racing that I feel my fingerprints are on, and some people would say negative as well, positive, but I mean I'm very comfortable. I know my values and principles of what I have and I haven't done in this world, and at the end of the day, you can escape everything other than your own thoughts. I sleep very comfortably at night. I'm deeply principled. I'm absolutely not a fair weather friend, and I have weaknesses. Probably my biggest weakness is, you break my trust, it's over, it's irreparable. But that's just the way I am. So you tend to have a bit of flotsam behind you in my life, people that have done things that I felt broke my trust, and then you just say, broken. And then it's just better to get on. But there are other people that the world love. They're huggy and kissy, and they're basically, everybody likes them. Why? Because they say all the right things at the right time, irrespective of whether there's sincerity and truth in it. Much better to everybody, those people enjoy the adulation of being a very, very popular person. I live with myself, for better, for worse, and I'm a good person to have as a friend, not a great person to have as an enemy. My only motivation to write an autobiography is to make sure that my grandchildren can read something which is my version. And that objective tends to see me kick the can down the road a little bit. But I have kept a lot of material to try and at least refresh my memory as to why things happened and when they happened. So actually, for it to be an interesting read, I think it shouldn't have much motor racing in it, which probably most people will find surprising. But I think the things that make people interesting and different is try and explain why you did things and what your motives were, what your passions were, how you felt at a given moment of time, and why emotion is a luxury. If you're very angry or you're very happy, I don't think you're in the best frame of mind to make decisions. So I think for years I was considered, emotionless and devoid of emotion. Obviously, when the television cameras fell on me, I pretty straight face, but I just said, "You don't understand. Why on earth wouldn't you want to focus on the job in hand?" If people say to me, what's it like going to, socialising with Ron? They are surprised with the answer they get, because as hard as I focus on being disciplined and devoted and focused to my business. It's equally and oppositely the way when I'm having fun. And I'm deeply opposed to social media. I'm deeply opposed to people taking pictures at my parties or anything. You come to one of our parties, you're there to enjoy the party. And if you need to share the experience with a third party, don't come. You know, be there for the experience, and enjoy the moment. But don't expect to make me happy if you're going to start putting things on social media. You know, definitely, two friends have been, fallen out with me for that and aren't my friends anymore, because it really, I think that's not the way life is. You know, it's not me. I have a friend who is a neurosurgeon and is, with two other neuroscientists, have developed something which I think is going to dramatically change things for a relatively large quantity of people in the world, a procedure. It actually addresses back pain, a specific type of back pain that probably, as far as their research has shown, is about 30% of the people with back pain will be relieved of their back pain if this process and procedure works. They are not well equipped to monetize this, having spent a great deal of their own money. There's been some family and friends funding on it. So I'm trying to contribute to that process, and again, I think it's got a slight change the world feel about it, which if it's as successful as I hope it will be, it will have that. Keeping my children's feet on the ground. Challenging is you become wealthier and wealthier in life, and you see how money, very often third or fourth generation, destroys people. Their inability to appreciate it, understand it, not abuse it. I think I've equipped my children well, and for that, simple principles but constantly enforced throughout their childhood. Now they're all professionals. I absolutely told them early on, forget following me into this business. Two reasons is why burden them with trying to emulate my success. I think it's anyone that's close to me is, it's not easy. But why put that pressure on your children? So I encourage them into different things. My youngest is an architect. My son has a daughter in Austin. My son is a product design engineer, and my eldest daughter's a doctor. So all doing their own thing, all passionate, different levels of passion, but nevertheless passionate about their lives. And I try to facilitate and assist in them pursuing their passions. So really these are part of looking forward. So I don't really spend too much time looking back. As I've said, there are things I'm proud of, there's things that I'm less proud of, but at the end of the day, you can go the statistical route and say it is unlikely that anyone's going to surpass my race achievements in my lifetime. 17 World Championships, 150 odd Grand Prix wins. I still have people come up to me, and have done for years, and say, we've been to your facilities, they're mind-blowing. How do you keep these standards? How do you keep this mindset? How, and the answer is by phenomenal attention to detail and by sharing and infecting people with your passion for perfection, your desire for perfection. You can't always be the best, but you can look the best. We might not have the fastest car on the race circuit, but you can do the fastest pit stop. Why not? Have pride in that. It's it's not going to make a difference. It does make a difference. It does make a difference. And this is tiny examples of how I think. I'm not the first person to identify passion as the core ingredient of success. And secondly, I was there to say, my success has come from passion. So don't underestimate. If you're not passionate about what you do, which is the sort of hidden opposite to what I was saying, don't do it. You will not succeed in greatness. You will not be a super achiever if you're not passionate about what you do.
McLaren, faithful the home of authentic Formula One storytelling. I'm Mr. Papaya, an independent Formula One journalist and passionate voice behind the visor. This channel delivers in-depth race analysis, breaking news, driver insights, strategy breakdowns, and honest opinions across the Formula One grid. If you're a die-hard Formula One fan, you're in the right place. Here, it's not just about what happened, it's about why it matters. From team dynamics and on-track rivalries to behind-the-scenes politics, I unpack every angle with clarity, heart, and a touch of papaya passion. Expect content that's personal, professional, and always fan-first. Join the conversation. Subscribe to become part of a growing community of Formula One lovers who want more than just headlines. They want truth through the visor.